The rancher opened his cabin door. A freezing Apache woman offered her body as a reward. The rancher had lived in solitude for as long as he could remember. His cabin sat at the edge of a vast valley surrounded by dense forests and towering mountains. The area was beautiful, especially in the warmer months, but when winter arrived, the land turned cold and unforgiving. Snow covered everything, and the wind howled like a wild animal, echoing through the trees and across the frozen fields. At 32 years old, the rancher had come to terms with his life alone. He had inherited the land from his father, who had passed away many years ago. His father had been a hard man, a man of few words, but he had taught the rancher everything he knew about caring for cattle and surviving the harsh winters. The rancher had taken over the farm when he was just 20, and since then he had managed the land by himself. He didn't mind the quiet. The land had always been his companion, and the animals, too. He spent most of his days checking on the cattle, making sure they had enough food and water, and tending to any repairs needed around the cabin. His evenings were spent in front of the fire, the only warmth he could find in the freezing cold. The silence, for the most part, was comforting. But even a man who cherished his solitude could only take so much isolation before it started to wear on him. That evening, as the blizzard outside grew fiercer, the rancher settled into his favorite chair by the fire, trying to find some comfort in the glow of the flames. He had finished his work for the day and had just started reading a book his father had left behind. It was an old one, filled with stories of the old days, tales of great ranchers, wild horses, and adventures in the land. The wind slammed against the cabin's walls, shaking the old wood. The rancher put the book down for a moment, his thoughts wandering. He had often wondered what it would be like to share his life with someone else, to have a family. But those thoughts were fleeting. There was no one out here. No woman had ever come to his door, and he didn't expect that to change. As the storm howled outside, the rancher glanced at the clock above the mantel. It was well past midnight. The storm was supposed to pass, but it had only grown worse with time. The snow piled up outside, creating a blanket of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The rancher leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and tried to drift into sleep, the sound of the wind outside acting like a lullaby. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke the stillness. At first, the rancher thought he had imagined it. No, would be out here in this kind of weather. He stood up slowly, uncertain of what to do. The wind had made it nearly impossible to see much past the window, and he hadn't seen any sign of life for miles. The knocking came again, louder this time. His heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? A traveler? A fellow rancher who had lost their way in the storm? He grabbed his rifle, just in case, and walked cautiously to the door. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached, the floorboards creaking beneath him. With a quick glance through the window, he saw nothing but the swirling snow, the darkness thick outside. But the knocking persisted. He opened the door, his rifle ready just in case. What he saw took him completely by surprise. Standing in the doorway, nearly collapsing from exhaustion, was a woman. How? Her dark hair was matted against her head, her clothes frozen stiff with snow, and her face was pale, almost ghostly. She was shivering uncontrollably, her hands pressed against her chest in an attempt to warm herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rancher's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The woman appeared to be of Apache descent, but she looked lost, as if she had been traveling for days. Her eyes were wide with fear, but they also held a deep sadness. The rancher stepped forward, his first instinct to help her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but full of concern. She barely nodded, her lips trembling as she spoke. "I need shelter," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Please, please help me." Without a second thought, the rancher stepped aside, letting her into the warmth of the cabin. She stumbled as she entered, her legs buckling beneath her. He caught her just in time, his hands strong and steady as he supported her weight. "Come, sit by the fire," he said, leading her over to the hearth. She collapsed onto the chair, still shaking uncontrollably. The rancher quickly went to the woodpile, adding a few more logs to the fire to ensure it would burn brighter. The heat from the flames began to thaw her out, and she sighed deeply in relief. He grabbed a blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her, trying his best to make her comfortable. As the warmth started to seep into her frozen limbs, she began to relax, her body still tense, but no longer trembling. The rancher busied himself with preparing a pot of hot water, thinking she might need tea or something to warm her from the inside. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured. I thought I wouldn't make it." The rancher nodded. "You're safe now. Just rest. We'll figure out the rest later." He didn't press her for answers, sensing that she had been through a great deal. Instead, he set about gathering some food, heating up some stew from the night before and offering her a bowl. She accepted it gratefully, barely able to lift her hands to the spoon. The rancher couldn't help but watch her as she ate. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her features were delicate, her dark eyes full of mystery. The snowstorm outside had brought her to his door, and now he found himself wondering who she was and where she had come from. She seemed like a stranger, but there was something about her that felt familiar, as if their paths were meant to cross, even if only for this brief moment in time. As she finished her meal, the rancher refilled her bowl and offered her more, but she declined. She seemed to have grown tired again, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. He took her empty bowl and set it aside, then sat across from her, unsure of what to say next. For a long while they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. The rancher was still processing the unexpected turn of events. He had not expected anyone to show up at his door, much less someone who seemed so broken, so vulnerable. He glanced at the clock again. It was nearing 2 in the morning. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the rancher knew it was too dangerous for her to travel any further tonight. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said softly, breaking the silence. The woman nodded, her eyes closing in gratitude. The rancher sat back in his chair, watching the fire flicker as he pondered what the morning would bring. Whatever her story was, it seemed like it had brought her to him in the most unexpected way, and somehow, deep down, he knew that this encounter would change both of their lives forever. The rancher watched as the woman slowly settled into the warmth of the cabin. Her body was still stiff from the cold, but the heat from the fire was working its magic. Her shivers had calmed, and her breathing had become steadier. The rancher didn't want to disturb her, but he couldn't help but wonder who she was, and how she had found herself so far from home in such a brutal storm. He returned to his chair, sitting across from her. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin there was a peaceful quiet now. The fire crackled and popped, casting soft light that danced on the walls. It had been years since the rancher had had any real company, and the presence of this stranger, this woman who had knocked on his door, was a strange comfort. The woman's eyes remained closed for a few moments, her body resting as she tried to find peace. The rancher gave her space, not wanting to rush her, knowing that whatever brought her here had to be heavy on her mind. He began to make his own thoughts, wondering what kind of life she had led to find herself wandering in such a state. He wasn't the type of man to pry, but the silence between them was becoming harder to bear. His curiosity about her was growing, but he wasn't sure how to ask her about it without making her feel uncomfortable. Finally, after a long silence, the woman spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I never thought I'd make it through the storm," she said softly, her words almost lost in the crackling of the fire. The rancher looked at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm glad you're safe now," he said simply. She nodded, but her face grew darker with thought. "I didn't know where else to go. The snow, oh, it just kept coming. And I was alone." The rancher's heart softened. "Where did you come from?" he asked gently, his voice calm. "How did you end up out here?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket wrapped around her. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if she had to decide how much to share. After a pause, she met his eyes and spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I was traveling with my people," she began, her eyes far away, as if she was seeing something beyond the walls of the cabin. "We were on our way to meet with other tribes, but we were attacked. It was sudden, brutal." Her voice faltered slightly, and she paused to take a breath before continuing. "I got separated from them. The others, I don't know what happened to them. I've been trying to survive on my own ever since." The rancher could hear the pain in her voice. She had clearly been through something harrowing, something she wasn't yet ready to fully explain. His heart went out to her, but he didn't want to push her for details. He knew that sometimes the best thing to offer was just a listening ear. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been very hard." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It was," she admitted, her voice distant. "I've lost many things in my life. My family, my home. But there's nothing like the cold to remind you that you're truly alone." The rancher could sense the weight of her words. She had experienced loss, maybe more than he could even understand. Her people had likely been forced to wander the wilderness, just as he had spent years alone in this cabin. But he had always had his land, his cattle, and the warmth of the fire. She had nothing. She had been a stranger, lost and alone in the snow, with no one to turn to. He was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say next. Instead, he stood up, moved quietly to the kitchen, and began preparing a simple meal. He figured she could use something to eat, something to help her settle. As he worked, he kept stealing glances at her. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and sadness, her eyes heavy from the weight of her journey. He could tell she was trying to process everything, trying to find a way to make sense of her life. When the food was ready, the rancher returned to her side and offered her a bowl of stew. It wasn't much, just something he had thrown together with the last of his supplies, but it would be warm and filling. She accepted it quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she took the bowl from him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She dipped her spoon into the stew, the warmth of the food bringing a little color back to her face. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, her eyes focused on the food, but her mind clearly elsewhere. The rancher watched her for a moment, feeling a bit out of place. He wasn't used to having someone in his cabin, much less someone who had gone through so much hardship. He had always lived alone, kept to himself, and worked his land without much thought of others. But now, in this moment, it felt different. There was something about her, something that made him feel like he wasn't the only one carrying a heavy load. As she finished her meal, she finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, something raw, something vulnerable, that made him pause. She seemed to be searching for something, perhaps reassurance or understanding, and the rancher found himself wanting to offer both. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was an edge of confusion to her words. "I am nothing, just a woman who has lost everything. Why would you help me?" The rancher was taken aback by the question. He hadn't really thought about it before. It wasn't that he felt a sense of duty, though he did. It wasn't that he saw her as a burden. He simply couldn't ignore someone in need, especially not when she was standing right in front of him, asking for help. "I couldn't leave you out there," he said simply, shrugging as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Everyone deserves help when they need it. No one should be alone in a storm like that." Her eyes softened at his words. She didn't say anything for a moment, but her gaze lingered on him as if she were studying him. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. Yet you're offering me your kindness." The rancher didn't know what else to say. Maybe he was just a man who had lived too long in solitude, who had become accustomed to the idea that everyone needed help and that kindness was not something to question. "I know what it's like to be alone," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "And I know what it's like to need help, that's all." She stared at him for a long time, as though his words were weighing heavily on her. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "I will not forget this," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. The rancher smiled gently. "You don't have to," he said. "Just rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." The woman closed her eyes, sinking back into the chair, and the rancher felt a quiet sense of peace settle over the cabin. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the simple act of sharing a meal had created something more, a connection, however small, between two people who had never expected to meet, but who now shared a moment of understanding. The rancher couldn't sleep that night. The wind outside still howled, battering against the walls of the cabin. He could hear it whistling through the cracks in the old wood, and every now and then the force of it made the windows shake. But even with the storm raging outside, inside the cabin there was a sense of calm. The woman had fallen into a deep sleep by the fire, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. Her chest rose and fell steadily as she slept, the warmth of the flames doing its job, thawing her body and easing her pain. The rancher sat in his chair, the only light coming from the fire, casting flickering shadows across the room. He wasn't sure what to do. He had never been good with people, especially not strangers. But something about the woman, her quiet strength despite everything she had endured, made him want to help her. He had always lived a solitary life, doing what needed to be done and keeping to himself. But now, with her here, it felt different. He glanced over at her again. She was beautiful, in a way that was both delicate and strong. Her dark hair, now free of snow, fell in waves over her shoulders. Her face, though tired, had a natural grace to it. The rancher hadn't expected to feel so drawn to someone so quickly, especially someone who was in such a vulnerable position. Yet there she was, quietly resting, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her. He stood up and moved quietly to the window, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Outside, the snow continued to fall, heavy and thick, blanketing the world in a thick layer of white. It was hard to see much beyond the edges of the cabin, but he knew that the storm wasn't letting up any time soon. The woman wouldn't be able to travel anywhere in this weather. She would have to stay here, with him, until the storm passed. He wasn't sure how long that would be, but he knew it was best not to rush things. As the hours passed, the rancher finally gave in to sleep, though it came in short bursts. Every now and then, he'd wake to check on the woman, making sure she was still comfortable and warm. She slept soundly, though every so often, a soft sigh would escape her lips, and he would wonder what dreams haunted her. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't think it was his place, but he couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, to his cabin, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm. By morning, the snow had slowed, but the wind was still strong. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old house settling. The rancher rose early, as he always did, to check on his cattle. He had no idea how long it would take for the storm to pass, but he couldn't ignore his responsibilities. The cattle needed food, and the barn needed repairs. It was hard to explain why he couldn't ignore the work, but it was just something he had always done. He dressed in his thick woolen clothes and grabbed his coat from the hook near the door. Before he left, he turned to the woman. She was still sleeping, her body curled in a way that made her look small and fragile, despite her strength. The rancher felt a pang of guilt leaving her alone, but he had no choice. The cattle had to be tended to. He left the cabin, closing the door quietly behind him. The cold hit him as soon as he stepped outside, the wind biting at his face and making his breath fog in the air. The snow had piled up around the cabin, and it was hard to see beyond a few feet in front of him. He trudged through the snow, his boots sinking deep with each step. The barn was a few hundred yards away, and he made his way toward it, moving carefully through the snowdrifts. The cattle were huddled together for warmth in the far corner of the barn, and the rancher went about his work feeding them and making sure they had enough to drink. His mind kept drifting back to the woman. He couldn't help but think about what she had said the night before. She had mentioned that she was traveling with her people and that they had been attacked. He wondered if they were still alive. He wondered if she had been able to find anyone else. He had no way of knowing, and that thought bothered him. The uncertainty weighed on him as he worked, but there was little he could do about it. For now, all he could do was focus on what was in front of him. It was a few hours before he returned to the cabin. By then, the woman had woken up. She was sitting by the fire, her hair still damp from sleep, but looking much better than she had the night before. Her skin had regained some of its color, and there was a quiet energy about her now that hadn't been there before. She looked up at him as he entered, and for the first time there was a small, tentative smile on her face. "I didn't mean to wake up so late," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I guess I needed the rest." The rancher smiled in return. "It's all right, you needed it." He set down the bucket of water he had brought in and moved to the hearth to stoke the fire. "I've taken care of the cattle," he said, "but I imagine you're hungry by now." She nodded, her stomach growling in agreement. "I haven't eaten much in the past few days," she admitted. "It's been hard to find food on my own." The rancher didn't say anything right away. He moved to the small stove in the corner of the room, preparing a simple meal. It was just stew again, the same as last night, but it was warm and filling. He ladled it into 2 bowls, setting one down in front of her. "It's not much, but it'll help," he said. She took the bowl and offered him a small smile. "Thank you," she said again, the gratitude in her voice clear. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she hadn't had a decent meal in far too long. The rancher watched her for a moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that he had been able to offer her something, even if it was just food. As the morning passed into afternoon, the rancher and the woman sat together, talking more openly than they had the night before. She explained more about her journey, about the life she had left behind, and about the tribe she had once been a part of. The rancher listened quietly, offering her the space to speak without judgment. He didn't press her for details, but he was fascinated by the stories she shared. They were different from anything he had ever known, filled with traditions, family bonds, and a deep connection to the land that was unfamiliar to him. She, in turn, listened as the rancher shared his own life with her. His stories were simple, mostly about his father, his years of working the land, and the quiet life he had chosen for himself. There was little adventure in his life, nothing like the tales she had told, but there was a certain peace in the way he spoke, and the woman found herself drawn to that calmness. It was the kind of peace she had longed for, a kind of peace that had eluded her since the attack on her people. As the afternoon sun began to fade, the woman's eyes grew heavy again. She hadn't slept much the night before, and the warmth of the cabin, coupled with the food, was beginning to make her drowsy. The rancher noticed, and without saying anything, he moved to his chair by the fire, offering her the seat near the warmth. "You can rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." She smiled faintly, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. And soon she was asleep again, her head resting against the back of the chair, her face peaceful. The rancher sat quietly, his thoughts drifting. The storm outside had finally begun to die down, and the silence in the cabin was comforting. But as he looked at the woman resting so peacefully, he realized that this quiet, simple life he had lived for so long was no longer the same. She had entered his world, and with her she had brought something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of connection. The next morning the rancher woke early, as he always did. The sun had barely risen, and the first light of dawn crept into the cabin through the thin cracks in the walls. He had grown used to the quiet of mornings, but today it felt different. The woman, still here, resting by the fire, was a reminder that his routine had been disrupted in ways he hadn't expected. He hadn't anticipated how much her presence would affect him. He stood quietly, his feet padding softly across the wooden floor as he moved to the window. The storm from the night before had passed, and although the sky was still overcast, there was a faint glow on the horizon. The snow-covered land outside looked untouched, serene, as if the world had been paused for just a moment. He thought about the work that awaited him, feeding the cattle, checking the barn, and making sure everything was secure for the coming days. But today, the tasks didn't seem as pressing as they had before. He felt a pull to stay inside, to be there for the woman who had unexpectedly come into his life. He turned back to see her still asleep by the fire. The blanket she had wrapped herself in had slipped slightly, exposing her shoulders to the warmth of the flames. Her face, usually so serious and guarded, now looked peaceful, almost childlike in its calmness. The rancher couldn't help but feel a pang of affection for her. She had been through so much, and yet there she was, sleeping soundly, free from the immediate dangers of the cold, the storm, and whatever hardship she had faced before. He admired her strength, but he also knew that beneath it she was still fragile, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. The rancher let out a slow breath and moved to his usual morning routine. He fed the cattle and checked the barn, though his mind kept drifting back to the woman inside the cabin. When he returned, he found her awake, sitting up by the fire. Her hair was a little messy from sleep, but there was something more relaxed about her now. She didn't look as guarded as before. Perhaps, after a night of rest, she felt a little more at ease. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting," she said softly, glancing up at him as he entered. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." The rancher smiled, offering a gentle shake of his head. "You needed rest. You've been through a lot. Don't worry about it." She nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "I haven't slept that deeply in a long time," she admitted. "It feels different here, peaceful." The rancher's smile grew a little I guess that's what this place is. It's quiet, a little lonely sometimes, but peaceful. She looked around the room, her eyes taking in the small cabin, the simple furniture, and the warm fire crackling in the hearth. "It's nice," she said, her voice soft. "It's more than I've had in a long time." The rancher didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't ever thought much about his cabin in those terms. He had always just seen it as a place to sleep, a place to work from. But now, with her here, it felt more like a home. He felt a strange sense of pride in it, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, wanting to change the subject, to keep the conversation light. "You look like you're more yourself today." She smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I am, thank you. The warmth, the food, it's all made a difference. I feel stronger." The rancher nodded, but a small part of him felt unsettled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was hanging over them, something unspoken between them. The woman had shared some of her story with him, but he knew there was more to it. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't help but wonder if she had truly come to terms with everything that had happened to her. She was a survivor, he could see that. But survival didn't always mean healing. She seemed to sense his thoughts. After a moment of quiet, she spoke again, her voice low. "I know you're wondering about what happened to me. My people." The rancher froze, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't looking at him now, her gaze focused on the fire. But he could hear the weight in her voice. She had been carrying this pain with her for so long, and he had only just met her. But somehow, in the small space of the cabin, it felt like they had known each other for much longer. "You don't have to tell me," he said gently, though his voice was filled with compassion. "Only if you're ready." She shook her head slightly, then took a deep breath. "It's not about being ready," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. It's just that there's so much to say, so much I can't even put into words. My people, we were supposed to be strong together, but we were divided, and then the attack came. It happened so quickly. I thought I had lost everyone. And I almost did." The rancher stepped closer, sitting across from her. He didn't know what to say, but he wanted her to know she wasn't alone. "Sometimes the hardest part is when you feel like you've lost everything," she continued, her eyes distant. "The ones who should have protected me, they were the ones who left me behind. I'm not sure why. I don't even know what happened after that. I've been wandering ever since." The rancher sat quietly, listening. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just listened as she told him of her people, of her family, and the journey she had been on since the attack. Her voice broke when she spoke of her loss, but she held back her tears. It was clear she had learned to keep them inside, to bury the pain and press forward. The rancher couldn't blame her. He had his own ways of coping with loneliness and hardship, but he could also see that the woman needed to let go, if only a little. "Where will you go now?" the rancher asked after a long silence. She looked at him, her eyes soft, as though she hadn't quite considered the question herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I can't go back, and I can't stay in one place forever. But for now, I'll stay here. I think I need more time." The rancher nodded. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. There's no hurry." For the first time, the woman smiled, a real smile. It was small, but it reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. I think I need this time. To heal, to think. You've given me a place to rest. I won't forget that." The rancher smiled in return, but inside, he was still uncertain. He had given her space, offered her comfort, and even a small measure of peace. But he knew that healing wasn't something that happened quickly. She would need time, and maybe, just maybe, he could give her that. As the day wore on, they continued to talk. It was a quiet conversation, one that touched on the surface of their lives but never went too deep. They spoke of simpler things: the weather, the animals, the land they both called home. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the moment. The storm outside had passed, and with it came a new kind of quiet, one that wasn't born of loneliness, but of shared understanding. For the first time in a long while, the rancher felt something stir inside him, a sense of connection that he hadn't known he was missing. And for the woman, perhaps, it was the beginning of something new, too.